This chapter looks in some depth at the so-called Kalam cosmological argument. That's a cosmological argument that puts an emphasis upon arguing that the universe had a beginning, has a finite temporal past, and that the finite temporal past of the universe implies the need for a transcendent cause of the universe. There are a number of different ways of unpacking the Kalam cosmological argument. I think what all the arguments have in common is the idea that given that the universe has a finite past, temporally speaking, given the idea that the cosmos had a beginning, that this raises some need for an explanation of the cosmos outside of itself. But you can unpack in different ways the reason one might think that a cosmos with a finite past implies the need for a cause outside of itself. Is it the mere fact that anything with a finite past must have a cause? Or is it the fact that the kind of thing that the universe is, being a physical thing, is what implies the need for a cause outside of itself, given that there's a beginning to it in particular? The way I prefer to unpack the kind of causal implication from the finitude of the past is by putting an emphasis on the fact that the universe is a series of physical events. And if there was a first physical event, because the universe has a finite past, there's a first physical event. And I think it's the fact that physical events are by nature contingent realities that particularly implies the need for some transcendent cause of the universe. So in a way, I think the Kalam cosmological argument raises in a very sort of poignant way, as it were, the issue dealt with within the contingency type cosmological argument that we looked at in the previous chapter. But the fact that there is a first contingent physical reality means that you can't explain the existence of that physical reality in terms of by appealing to the previous physical reality, because there isn't a previous one, because it's the first physical event. And I think that raises in a particularly pointed way the need for an explanation of the universe outside of itself. William Lane Craig particularly rejuvenated the discussion about the Kalam cosmological argument. He did his first PhD on this argument and published a book in 1979 called The Kalam Cosmological Argument that reinvigorated the discussion, particularly by mentioning the way in which contemporary cosmological theories were, even at that stage, pointing to the fact that the universe had a beginning in the Big Bang cosmological theories, whereas in its medieval incarnations, this argument had particularly focused around a sort of fairly abstract philosophical, mathematical arguments about the possibilities or impossibilities of there being an infinite past. Craig still thinks those arguments are very useful and interesting arguments, but he pointed out that even if you thought it was possible that the past be infinite, the actual empirical evidence that was coming in from Big Bang cosmology indicated that, as a matter of fact, the past was not infinite. So maybe you could think, well, it's possible that the past be infinite, but actually it isn't, because there was a finite past implied by the Big Bang cosmology. And so Craig, by uniting the medieval discussion with contemporary discussions in cosmology, really reinvigorated discussion about the Kalam argument. The traditional way that Bill Craig has put the Kalam argument is to say this, that whatever begins to exist must have a cause. That the universe began to exist, and therefore it must have a cause. Now, I think there's at least a possibility of an ambiguity in the language of what we mean by beginning to exist, potentially derailing the argument here. Because when we say something began to exist, I think we could mean one of two things. We could mean it has a finite past, temporally speaking. Such that if you were to hop into the TARDIS and go back in time, there would be a first day of the existence of something before which there's no previous day of its existence, because this is the first one, a first hour, a first minute, whatever unit of time you choose to measure. There's a finite number of those units in the past existence of something. So that's one sense of began to exist, has a finite past. It's also possible to slip into sometimes talking about things coming into existence. But that's a use of language that implies a pre-existing set of already existing things, as it were. It's like talking about coming into the room, which implies the pre-existence of the room to which one enters. So we can sometimes talk about, the universe came into existence. But I think there's a danger there of then, does that imply, are you implying by that language the pre-existence of something, or of the universe, or something outside of the universe? We don't want to beg those kind of questions, and I think we want to be careful to say that what the arguments and the evidence of Big Bang cosmology point to is the finitude of the past, but they don't imply that the universe came into a pre-existing set of existing things. That evidence all implies that the universe has a finite past. When we then move to talking about applying some sort of causal principle, so Craig's, whatever begins to exist needs a cause, there again, if you iron out that potential ambiguity, you could say, well, is he claiming anything that has a finite past must have a cause, or that anything that comes into existence must have a cause? Now, there, perhaps I just don't share his metaphysical intuitions, because I think while it's clear that anything that comes into existence must have a cause, we wouldn't we would be very surprised if something just popped into existence here and now, and we certainly wouldn't take as a lessening of our surprise the response, well, things can just pop into existence without causes. We think, well, there must be some reason why it popped into existence. But must things have a cause just because they have a finite past, even if they didn't come into existence as well? I'm not sure. In my favoured way of defending the Kalam cosmological argument, I put an emphasis on the need of physical events to have causes, that any physical event must have some kind of cause outside of itself. And a major objection that you will repeatedly find in the literature on this issue, particularly when you're looking at new atheist writers or popular sort of objections to this kind of argument, is some sort of appeal to quantum mechanics. To say, doesn't quantum mechanics show that things can come into existence, that physical events can happen without a cause? No, it does not, basically. At most, as even atheist philosophers of science recognise, at most quantum mechanics shows that you can have some sort of a causal transition of physical states, not that you get a physical state arising from nothing, from no causal background at all. It might not be a one-to-one causal relationship, it might be governed by a statistical physical law, but it is not a case of a physical event happening with no causal background outside of itself. That is simply a misinterpretation of quantum mechanics to try and push it as an objection to that idea.